2015 has been a busy year for Chinese President Xi Jinping. He began the year by visiting China's all-weather partner, Pakistan, attended the Bandung Conference in Indonesia, then took part in the BRICS Summit and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Ufa, Russia, this summer. Later on, he visited the US and UK. His trip to Singapore this fall led to a historic meeting with the Taiwan leader, Ma Ying-jeou. There was the G20 summit in Turkey and the APEC summit in the Philippines. Xi made climate change commitments at the Paris talks and then headed to Johannesburg for the China-Africa Forum. Some of the key policies and programs getting great attention this year: the Asia Infrastructure Development Bank and the One Belt, One Road initiative. Handshakes sealed multi-billion-dollar deals. What are the highlights that reflect a change in China's foreign policy, and what are the reasons behind the shift? Joining me now to talk about all of this from Beijing, Victor Gao. He is a Chinese international relations expert. From Johannesburg, Bob Wekesa, research associate at the China-Africa Reporting Project at the University of the Witwatersrand. From London, Kerry Brown. He is a professor of Chinese studies at King's College. And with me in the studio is Andrew Small, Transatlantic Fellow with the German Marshall Fund's Asia program. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Victor, Xi Jinping has undertaken more than 30 foreign trips since becoming president of China. Broadly speaking, what's the underlying strategic objectives or aims with these trips?
President Xi Jinping has turned out to be a very proactive and actively engaged Chinese president as far as China's foreign policies are concerned. He has made more visits to foreign countries than his two predecessors, former Chinese President Jiang Zemin and former Chinese President Hu Jintao. I think he's very much leading the Chinese foreign policy in his very unique way. And several things stand out very prominently. One is his brainchild concept, One Belt, One Road, which is mostly a Eurasian development concept focusing on infrastructure and connectivity. Together with this, you mentioned the AIIB and many other financial institutions that China is forming right now. The second thing is the big power diplomacy between China and the United States, China and UK, China and Russia, and many other major powers in the world. Then the neighboring countries' relations, both on-land neighbors as well as maritime neighbors, etc. Then the Chinese tradition of emphasizing relations with Africa, with Asian countries and Latin American countries, etc. All these combined make sure that Xi Jinping wants to promote China's international profile, and in his own term, China is getting closer and closer to the real center of the global stage. And he wants to make sure that this transition to the real center of the global stage is smooth and it contains no surprises, and China can manage good relations not only with the major powers, but also with the neighboring countries, with Latin American countries, African countries, Asian countries, and also China's foreign policy is very much conducted within the United Nations framework, emphasizing on the global leadership role of the United Nations and the international organizations. This makes President Xi Jinping's foreign policy focus very unique, and it's in line with the rising power of China and the great expectation on the Chinese shoulder in the coming years and coming decades.
Well, let's look at the relationship with Africa. Let's go to Bob in Johannesburg. Bob, it seems Africa occupies a special place in China's foreign policy. President Xi was in South Africa. He hosted that very big conference there between China and the leaders of African countries. And China's influence on the continent, we know, has been growing. But is it all about economics? Is it just the economic relationship that's growing? In 2014, Li Keqiang was there, and he said, that's the Chinese premier, he said that China plans on investing $20 billion by 2020 in African countries. Is it just about economics, or is there more to this?
No, I think it goes beyond, well beyond economics. Economics is important in the sense that it lays the infrastructure, the base or the foundation over which other forms of engagements can proceed. But let's not forget the politics and the geopolitics of that, in the sense that China, for example, if you look at a very symbolic aspect, just pointing out an example, every year, Africa is the first point of contact for a senior Chinese official, usually a president, a prime minister, premier like Li Keqiang or foreign minister. And this symbolism rise on the fact that the relationship between China and African countries is one of mutual respect, is one of non-interference, is one of, where there are sincere South-South cooperation, colleagues or nations that respect each other from a South-South cooperation perspective. In addition to that, I think African countries have come to increasingly rely on China for its position in the UN system and as a growing powers. In fact, on the African continent, many people cannot believe that China is still a developing country. We believe it is a superpower. In the UN system specifically, because China holds one of the 5 permanent seats at the UN Security Council, many African countries have come to rely on China wherever there are issues of a global nature. Countries such as Sudan, we saw what happened in Libya and how China came in after the initial mishap to kind of correct the situation. We've seen issues to do, for example, countries such as Kenya and its leaders being taken to the International Criminal Court,
right,
and how China came out forcefully to fight for the right of Kenya and so forth. So I think it goes beyond the mere economic considerations onto the politics and geopolitics of that.
All right, Kerry, President Xi, as Victor mentioned, has been a globe-trotting president. He's been to dozens of countries in the very short time that he's been president. Do you see any foreign policy pattern here, an overarching goal, if you like?
Yeah, I mean, I think that he's mapped out these narratives for China's engagement with the outside world. I mean, that's not so surprising. China's economic position now means it's a global actor, so it's not surprising, therefore, it's got a president who's a globetrotter. And I guess a lot of the sort of issues that China's facing in its developmental path now are going to have an international dimension. They're going to be soluble if they're soluble with, help and cooperation and partnership with outside actors. So I think we see, he's been able to map out these stories of, major power relations with the US, civilizational partners with the EU, which is the term he used a couple of years ago when he was in Brussels, and then this One Belt, One Road, which has become this kind of huge story of all these different partners. I suppose the only thing I'd say is at the moment we're in this era of abstraction. It's all very abstract. What does it mean? I mean, with the US, I think the core thing is the environmental cooperation. With the EU, it's always been a massive technology partner, so I think that'll deepen and just trying to even out some of the political issues. But the One Belt, One Road at the moment does seem very, very abstract. What is it, a policy or initiative? Where does it fit? How do people can engage with it? And does it have a security as well as an economic dimension? And I think that's the final thing, that there's the security issue. There's, I think, a lot of commonality when you talk about economics. Economics is intimately linked to security, but where is the sort of commonality when you get to hardcore security issues with the China story and the rest of the world?
Andrew, let's look at foreign policy in Asia. The signature policy appears to be the One Belt, One Road initiative. That's an economic policy, a development policy. But is there more to what China is looking at in Asia? You've got the United States, which has been talking about its pivot to Asia. What about China's security and diplomatic concerns, stability concerns in Asia?
Well, the One Belt, One Road initiative, of course, it incorporates a number of countries in Southeast Asia, but in certain respects, it's been a sort of counterpoint to the US-Asia rebalance, the US-Asia pivot. China expanding its political and economic presence in a part of the world where the United States has been relatively relaxed, relatively comfortable about seeing China developing a greater set of infrastructure and investment ties in Central Asia, the trip to Pakistan, and even the Russia visit, where I think the big and important agreement that was reached was consolidating the ties between the Eurasian Economic Union and the Silk Road Economic Belt, which I think was in doubt at the beginning of the year. But these are particularly on the continental Asia side. On the maritime Asia side, there's continued to be a degree of confrontation and competition with the United States. On that front, the important thing was Xi Jinping's visit to the United States earlier this year, where I think a degree of a floor has been put under US-China relations. I think they were heading in a direction that was causing some concern about the competitive dynamics that were underway. I think after the visit and some of the agreements reached, both on the regional issues and on the bilateral issues, it's meant that particularly going into an important year here in the US, the election year, that a base has been put under that. The difficulties that are there are still there, but I think the degree to which the two sides might have been heading in a more adversarial direction has been somewhat mitigated. So I think the Asia piece, you really have to look at both the continental and the maritime sides to where the stories are quite different.
Victor, there was a research poll conducted and published in Foreign Policy magazine looking at China's popularity around the world, and it showed that China enjoys enormous popularity in Russia and in Pakistan. I want you to just take a listen to what the Russian President Vladimir Putin had to say about the relationship. Let's watch.
Unfortunately, we have repeatedly seen that the world has not become more peaceful, and the joint work of China and the Russian Federation in all areas, including military, is a serious factor in stabilizing the situation in the world.
So, Victor, President Xi and President Putin, they've met several times. How do you see this Sino-Russian relationship evolve? Is it going to get much stronger?
I would say ever since President Xi Jinping took over the presidency in China, he has steered China-Russian relationships in a way that China-Russian relationships are now stronger and better than any time before. And I would say this bears a big fingerprint by both President Xi Jinping of China as well as President Putin of Russia. China and Russia need each other, both economically and trade-wise, but also more and more geopolitically. Even though the two countries are not strictly speaking allies with a mutual defense treaty, for example, the two countries increasingly see more and more major issues alike. And this paves the way for China and Russia to coordinate their strategic initiatives better and closer going forward, especially when the United States seems to be eager to pick a fight with Russia on the one hand and to pick a fight with China on the other hand. I would say, philosophically speaking, if the United States, the only superpower in the world, wants to confront both Russia and China together, it's a recipe for great disaster for the United States. And also, I would say, this incidentally forces China and Russia to embrace each other even more tightly than otherwise would be the case. Therefore, I would say China-Russia friendship or partnership have their own inherent logic, but also is very much as a counterweight against what they collectively perceive as pressure from the United States.
Bob, China announced just a few weeks ago that it will establish its first military outpost, and that's going to be in the East African state of Djibouti. The New York Times, in making that report, pointed out that this represents what the Times called a break with long-standing policy against building military facilities overseas. So looking at that development, how significant is it for China?
I think it's significant in many respects and from many multiple perspectives. But one must also look at it from a historical perspective, in the sense that the building of the base in Djibouti comes as a kind of a development on the fact that China has also been present in the Gulf of Aden for a couple of years now, in fact, from perhaps mid-2000s or thereabouts. And therefore, essentially, because of the piracy and the security issues after the collapse of Somalia as a unitary state, with instances of abductions at sea increasing and affecting trade. So China is not the only one that has had a presence there to kind of oversee the smooth transaction overseas and over the Indian Ocean. And I think it will be a development that leads to the need to establish a base there rather than logistically operate ships from as far as Chinese cities, Chinese coastal cities as that. In addition to that, China is increasingly getting involved in the peace and security infrastructure on the continent. I think for the first time late last year and into early this year, China sent combat troops to help out with the peace process in South Sudan. And this was significantly big numbers. And you don't need an outpost too far away from the places where the soldiers can refuel, the soldiers can replenish, and also the monitoring of various operations on the continent.